Hello, my fellow chefs. Today we talk braising short ribs, listening and paying attention in the kitchen, and tasting everything. I am Mark Grigsby, your chef and guide through this experience, and this is the incredible Discourse. Hello and welcome. I am Mark Grigsby, and you have found me here at the Incredible Discourse. First today, we're going to talk about a really good recipe that works in many different settings and is super delicious. The short rib. The short rib cut comes from the lower rib cage of the beef and could come from 4 different places: the chuck, plate, brisket, or rib, with the rib and brisket short ribs generally being the most expensive. If this is a foreign language to you, look up the fucking chart called the parts of the cow, and you'll see these pieces that I've mentioned. It's a very interesting science, quite honestly. I went to Cleveland, Ohio a while back to a certified Angus beef seminar where you meet with a beef scientist who has a legit PhD in this field. He took us into their lab and had us breaking down the animals while he did some demonstrations and lectures. He mentions where common cuts of beef we use typically come from, their preferred cooking technique, and then a really in-depth explanation of why we cook them this way. He even recalled the specific muscles of particular cuts and their functions, which actually really kind of helps you understand why we treat them as we do. I remember him pointing out that the short rib is best braised and they're cooked roughly the same way as other tough cuts of meat with lots of connective tissue, such as brisket, chuck roast, or shank. When cooked for a long period of time, at a low enough temperature, the tough connective tissue, called elastin, breaks down and becomes unctuously soft. This is what makes meat fall off the bone tender. If the protein elastin is exposed to high heat, it seizes up and becomes completely inedible, kind of like a rubber band. Anyway, I went left field there. The term short rib comes from the fact that this cut only has a portion of the long beef rib bone. Short ribs are usually cut in 2 different ways: the English style and the Korean style, which is also known as the flanken style. Now, the English style has a longer portion of that rib bone and a larger chunk of meat attached than the flanken style. The flanken style are typically used for barbecuing. Today, we're going to be using the English style and we will be braising them. And I love braising meat. It's easy, and when it's executed correctly, it always leaves you with a tender and satisfying dish. Braising is a combination cooking technique. It combines covered roasting and stewing. Oftentimes, the meat is browned and seared, and then partially submerged in a flavorful liquid, covered and roasted, creating a sort of steaming effect. After roasting for hours, the meat and bone are typically removed from the roasting pan and the liquid strained and reduced, creating this delicious demi-glace of sorts for your very tender and succulent short rib. There are many preparations of this dish with all sorts of combinations of ingredients, and today we're going to talk about one more variation, mine. My recipe is particularly easy and relatively basic, but sometimes you can't beat the classics. During our walkthrough of this recipe, I'll go through alternate preparations and ingredients to give you an idea of just how versatile the short rib can be. So let's get in it. Let's go over some equipment that you'll need to pull off this recipe. First, you'll need a deep skillet. I like cast iron skillets. They're heavy, and they hold the heat longer. They give you a nice, even sear. Next, you'll need a hotel pan or a casserole dish, something with deep sides because you'll be braising the short ribs, or shorties as they're called in the industry. These 2 pieces of equipment are the 2 most important. Outside of that, we just need a few other tools that will help us execute this recipe: a wooden spoon, a pair of tongs, a 4 to 6 quart sauce pot, a fine mesh sieve, and some aluminum foil. As usual, I'll leave a few links in the description of some equipment that works for this dish. Alright, let's get to what ingredients you will need to knock this down. Now, before we get there, this will be just like the last show. I won't detail here the measurements and all that. You can find all of the exact recipes and methods on theincrediblediscourse.com. We kind of hit a small wall with the YouTube channel, but it's coming, I promise. Anyway, we will need 3 or 4 bone-in short ribs. I like the bone-in because it gives you that wow factor, and I'll explain that when we get to the plating aspect of this recipe. Yes, they do sell boneless short ribs, and yes, this recipe will work for them. But today I'll be working this recipe with the short ribs with the bones. The ones with the bones work on the plating and setting that I want to explain today. If you wanted to make a short rib sandwich or maybe a mac and cheese or something like that, Boneless would be a great option, mostly because you usually pay for meat by the pound. If you're going to end up throwing away the bone and use the meat for a sandwich, you're basically throwing the money in the trash, plus all the work separating the bone from the meat and the connective tissue and all that. Don't do dumbass things that cost time and money. Also, I'm going to need some rough chopped carrots, celery, and yellow onion. In French cooking, mirepoix is the aromatic flavor base made by lightly cooking onions, celery, and carrots. The ratio is usually 2 to 1 to 1 onion heavy. In a lot of my recipes, especially stews, soups, and braises, I use this mix. A few smashed whole garlic cloves, some red wine, black peppercorns, tomato paste, beef or veal stock, and a bouquet garni. In case we've gotten this far and haven't noticed that this is a really French dish, and you'll come to see that many of the dishes that I like to do are French-inspired. A bouquet garni is a bundle of herbs that's been tied together or put in a porous container and cooked with the food. It's always taken out before serving, and it adds a subtle flavor and aromatic fragrance to the dish. This is what adds depth and dimension to the recipe. In my bouquet garni, I use thyme and rosemary. All right, now that all that shit is out of the way, we can move on to the good part, the actual cooking part. First, I'm going to take out the short ribs, and I'm going to pat them dry with a paper towel. I don't want them super wet because I want the seasoning to stick, and I want a nice, even sear. The sear is important here because you're trying to lock in the flavor of the beef and save some internal moisture. I season them with salt and cracked black pepper on all sides, and I'm not shy because beef requires a nice, bold seasoning. Now I heat my cast iron skillet on medium-high. Remember that talk that we had in the last episode about searing? Here it is again. You need high heat. I want it nice and hot. I want to hear this fucking cow scream when it hits the pan. So I'm going to add about 3 or 4 tablespoons of vegetable oil, and I sear the meat bone side up first. After a minute or two, I'm going to flip it on its side and sear that side. You're looking for a nice, even sear, a crust around the bone. I sear the bone side last, get a little color, and then I move the ribs to a holding plate until I need them. In the same pan, while it's hot, I'm going to add our mirepoix and reduce the heat to medium-low. I'll drizzle a touch more oil into the pan and coat the vegetables in it. The fond on the bottom of the pan will start to come off, and that's okay. It's all in the flavor plan. The cold vegetables in the hot pan will start off sizzling and really hot, but will quickly come to a calm and controlled one. Cook these vegetables slowly and sweat them until translucent. Sweating is a term you'll hear often in all sorts of recipes. It's the cooking technique that involves gently heating vegetables in a small amount of fat just to soften them and release their flavors. I want as little color on this as possible. Once the onions are translucent and the carrots and celery are soft, I'm going to stir in the peppercorns. I'm going to cook this for about 30 seconds to get the flavor going, and then I'm going to add the tomato paste. Before we go any further, let's talk about 2 things about tomato paste. 1, you don't need a lot of it, but you do need enough to coat all of the vegetables. For this recipe, you probably need about 1.5 tablespoons. The other thing about tomato paste is it usually comes packaged in a can or a tin tube. Because of this, you need to cook the can out. Air quotes. I used to work for a chef who told me that she could taste the can or the rawness of it, and she was right. This is a taste that you become familiar with over time. Tomato paste has a bitter, minerally taste to it, and it must be caramelized to bring out its sweetness. So I'm going to add the paste, coat the vegetables, and then keep cooking it while stirring. It will burn if I don't keep it moving. So you're going to notice some sticking to the bottom of the pan and browning, and that's good. Now you're developing like a double fond or a double flavor kind of deal. At this point, I'm going to add the wine and stir it well to combine, scraping the bottom of the pan to release all of the fond that is stuck to the bottom. This is going to build a lot of depth in the flavor department and make your sauce at the end super rich. You'll notice that the liquid starts to get a little thicker due to the combination of the wine and the paste. I'll need to cook this out for a little bit and burn out the alcohol, just like in the last episode with the shrimp and grits. Reduce this for about 8 to 10 minutes until you develop a nice and thick sauce-like liquid at the bottom. If you're unsure if the alcohol is burned out, smell it and taste it. If you smell it and you don't smell alcohol, taste it to be sure. This flavor is distinct. If you taste the alcohol, it needs to be reduced more. Now I'm going to add the beef stock. This will dilute this thick, almost pasty mixture. And I'm going to raise the heat by a little to medium-high and bring it to a simmer. Season a little bit with salt and pepper to make this mix taste good and to bring out the flavors. Now be careful when you add this mixture to the casserole dish, as it's hot as fuck and could splatter on you. Blisters and free tattoos are a real thing here, not to mention that it could stain your clothing. Just be careful. Once the mixture is safely in the dish, I'll add the short rib. The short rib shouldn't be completely submerged in this liquid, but almost. I'd say that the liquid should come up just over 3/4 of the way up the meat of the short rib. Remember, when we defined braising earlier, we noted that it is a combination cooking technique and that it is only partially submerged in this liquid. Now, the other catch is there has to be enough liquid in the dish, otherwise the vegetables and the mixture will burn, or you won't have enough liquid to make the sauce. We will be leaving this in the oven for hours at a time, so liquid is most important. Let's wrap this shit with aluminum foil and bake at 325 degrees for 2.5 to 3 hours, depending on the size of the short ribs. I notice that when you get them from a butcher, they tend to be a little larger in size than the grocery store, requiring more cooking time. I'll start checking to see if the ribs are done around the 2-hour mark. When complete, you'll notice that the meat has shriveled up a lot and the bone is exposed. Here's today's pro tip. When the bone is loose enough to be pulled from the meat and the meat is tender enough to fall off this bone, the short rib is done. However, for this recipe, I don't want you to pull the bone out completely. Remember the wow factor in plating I promised? We're almost there. Take the short rib out of the dish and put them on a holding plate to rest. Wrap in foil to keep them warm because the next step may take a few minutes. Take all of the juice and liquid and strain it through a fine mesh strainer into the sauce pot and bring the heat to medium. You want this liquid to reduce into a thick demi-glace-like sauce. Once the sauce is simmering, it should take about 6 to 8 minutes. Now we're ready to plate. In the last episode, we did an entirely composed plate. A starch, some vegetables, a protein, and a sauce with garnishes. This particular recipe is just for the short rib, but we can explore options based on setting. I'd say if I was at home and I was making this dish, it probably took a long time and now I'm fucking hungry. I want something filling and tasting, and my sons and wife would too. Kids don't like all that fancy shit, at least not my kids, so basic is better in their cases, and so mashed potatoes is probably the winner. My wife and I try to have them eat some kind of vegetables, green beans, asparagus, or even carrots. Those three give you 3 options with 3 different cooking techniques. Saute the green beans in garlic and butter, grill the asparagus, or roast the carrot. You see? Chef just hooked you up. Now, if I was in a casual restaurant, no, not the kind of place where you have to wear a fucking suit and tie and make a fucking reservation, but a place to go to eat that has a great ambiance that you can bring your whole family to. Something like $15 to $25 a plate, I get. You know, casual. I'd probably do something a little more eye-catching on the menu, like a short rib mac and cheese. And maybe this dish we could talk about in detail on a whole other episode. But the short version would be a baked mac and cheese with Gouda Mornay and some toasted panko, and then top that shit with the braised short rib and sauce. Holy shit, that's comfort on a completely different other level. If we took this dish into the fine dining type setting, I'd go all the way back to the beginning. I wouldn't necessarily carry out the same procedure that I did in this recipe. I probably wouldn't braise it. I'd most likely sous vide it, then remove the bone, press it in a pan with a little weight and chill it, then cut it into smaller blocks after trimming it, then sear it and present it on the bone with some roasted carrots and maybe a cauliflower puree or even a parsnip and fennel puree. The point is, this dish and its ingredients are very versatile and can be showcased in many different settings. And that's it. We braised some short ribs. There are many different variations. This one is a classic French take on it. Super delicious, always a hit. Let me know if you enjoyed making this recipe and what you paired it with. Send me your photos to theincrediblediscourse.com. I'm still working on getting the social channels up and available, but as soon as they are, I'll let you know. All right, now it's time for this week's Pro Tips. Pro Tips from a chef's lips. That's what I like to call it. Each episode, I'll give some tips about growing yourself in the culinary world. Some for home cooks and people interested in cooking, and some for professional cooks and chefs trying to grow their trade. Evolution is a big part of cooking, regardless of the setting you're in. Every time you cook something, you should try to do the best you can, because who the fuck likes to eat bad-tasting, inconsistent food? I can't think of a time when I told myself, well, yeah, I think I'll eat some bad food today. I may be tired or in a hurry and settle for something not as desirable, but I never skip crucial steps, techniques, or philosophies when I cook. And most of the time when I choose something less desirable, what I settle on is something that doesn't require loads of skills, just fundamentals because I'm at home or whatever. But in a professional setting, I always try to be consistent and better than I was yesterday. Anyway, today's pro tip for cooks of all walks of life. This is for home and professional. I want you to taste everything. I'm sure all of you have heard the word palate before. It's used a lot on various platforms when talking about cooking, culinary, kitchens. You hear it on cooking shows and cookbooks, on podcasts, everywhere, really. And that's because it's the basic or foundation of cooking. Simply put, when you're developing your palate, you're essentially programming your brain with flavors it's never tasted before. The more you taste something, the more your brain becomes familiar with it. Once you have a familiarity with a large variety of ingredients, dishes, and combinations, you can start to explore your own variations of recipes and ingredients. You'll also begin to train your mind when something is missing, and salt comes to mind here. Oftentimes, the recipe is very good and spot on, but it can be bland, and all it's missing is a little salt, and all those flavors will bloom. As your palate develops, you look for heat, herbs, sweetness, and a whole world of different things. Palates are all different, but they're all trained and programmed. If you're just starting out in the kitchen, home or professional, I would taste everything. I would taste all of my ingredients raw and cooked, and this is because you want to understand the transformation of these ingredients. Even the spices. Taste them before you put them in your cooking so that you understand what they're doing for that recipe. You'll start to program your palate for the smallest subtle differences. Earlier, we talked about tasting the can in the short rib recipe. But if you have little experience with this flavor, how would you know when you've cooked it out? Next time you cook with tomato paste, taste a little bit from the can, and then taste a little bit after it's cooked for a few minutes, and you'll see what I'm talking about. When I was a young cook getting into the industry, I knew that I would be surrounded by people who have been doing this way before I started. That means they've been eating, tasting, and smelling things for longer than I have. And I needed to get to their level and fast. And so, I tasted and smelled everything. Every sauce, every vegetable, raw and cooked, every seasoning, literally everything. Smelling helps program your brain by associating a smell with a taste or a flavor. And it took a while. But when I started to recognize flavors within the recipe, or when something was lacking salt, I knew I was starting to develop my palate. When I say everything, I literally mean everything, even if you don't like an ingredient. Maybe as a home cook, you may not want to taste something that you don't like because you're cooking for your family or whatnot, but as a professional, you almost have to. You have to know how to work with an ingredient, right? And a good basis of knowledge on the how-to starts with the question, what does it taste like? And here's a good example. I don't personally like eggplant, and I've had it many, many, many times. All the shapes, all the sizes, all the varieties, and I just don't like it. The texture, to me, is not pleasing. However, many people do love eggplant, and so as a chef, I need to know how to use it. Various recipes, techniques, and applications so that I can ultimately please the guest who's dining in my restaurant who chose the eggplant dish. When I was working the corporate circuit a while ago, we had a best practice of tasting everything before we opened the doors to any clients. It was one of my duties as the opening chef. We had cases and cases and cases of plastic spoons, and we were to, one by one, go down the line for each item on the station and taste every single thing. After a couple of weeks of repeating this process day in and out, I could tell you when something was made, what was missing, and in many cases, who even made it. I could taste the subtlest thing in the recipe. Was there salt? Was it seared well enough? Was it marinated long enough? And if there was something missing in that marinade. And you know, tasting products or ingredients that have gone sour or went bad isn't necessarily always a bad thing. Always smell it first. I've made the mistake many times of just randomly tasting something without smelling it first, and I dearly paid the price. Usually, your sense of smell will tell you if something is bad right off the bat. And no, I'm not saying eat helping after helping of bad shit on purpose and make yourself fucking sick. But if you smell it and you're not sure, taste it and spit it out. This best practice will help you define freshness. And as a chef, fresh, vibrant food is your spirit. It's your livelihood. And in the professional setting, a lot of times, it's your reputation. Don't be the guy known for serving bad food. It takes one review, report, or complaint to make everything start to crumble. Focus on developing your palate. It's truly one of your most valuable tools as a cook or a chef. All right, the next topic is truly for professional chefs and young cooks working in restaurants or the industry and are trying to take their game to the next level. Listen closely, talk less, ask questions, and pay attention. And I understand that there are many skills that need to be learned in the kitchen. Some of them difficult, some of them intense, some of them lengthy. But none of them are more important than listening. Yes, this shit may sound basic, and you're probably sitting there going, damn, I thought this asshole was going to say knife skills or heat or some other shit. But the reality is if you cannot listen closely, talk less, ask questions, and pay attention, you'll have a harder time learning how to use that knife, control that heat, or even interpret that recipe or technique. Paying attention is probably the key that stands out in all of this. And that's because paying attention requires you to listen closely, talk less, and ask questions if you do not understand. Paying attention in the kitchen is probably the most important piece of advice I can give to anyone who is struggling or even interested in moving up the culinary ladder. Your chefs and leadership team could be giving you all the answers, but if you're not paying attention, if you're not putting the ego and pride aside and focusing on what is being told to you, you will continue to stay complacent or even fall down that ladder, rung by damn rung by damn rung. And paying attention can mean a variety of things, including the call for intense focus, making sure your mind doesn't drift off about shit when you're brunoise the carrots and then all of your cuts are fucked and you have a jigsaw puzzle of shapes and sizes and wasted product and time. I know it sounds small and arbitrary, but if you can't focus on when you're cutting the vegetables, how can you take on bigger jobs like running a brigade or supervising the prep or plating the special? You have to focus. And paying attention could also mean listening with purpose and intent, making sure that you ask intelligent questions that pertain to the subject at hand. Repeat shit if you have to so that the person who's giving you these instructions or feedback or whatever, they know that you understand. Write everything down. Write recipes, draw plating diagrams, write prep lists and reminders. Keep yourself on track. I listen to a chef's podcast often, and he says something like, I trust the worst pen in the kitchen over the sharpest mind. And he says this because if you're writing shit down in the moment when it's fresh, it leaves nothing to interpretation later. I've had a little brown leather-bound book since my very first fine dining job in 2009 or 10, somewhere around there. But I hadn't gone to culinary school, and I was working with a bunch of very, very experienced chefs who were overachievers in just about everything that they did. I was in my 20s, and I had no idea that this world even existed. I had worked for a chain restaurant before this, and that was my first and only exposure to the industry to that date. So for me to understand what the fuck everyone was talking about, I carried around this little stupid book. I wrote down everything, terms, vocabulary. I drew myself pictures of the plate so I remembered how to plate the dishes on my station. I wrote the recipes down basically verbatim from the sous chef so I could do my daily prep and setup. I drew pictures of my station setup so that it would be the same way every single time. I had to do this because I was outmatched, outgunned, and inexperienced. The chef de cuisine there didn't like me because I didn't even go to culinary school. So on my first day in his kitchen, I was introduced to him by the executive chef. He shook my hand and didn't let go immediately, and he asked me, hey, did you go to culinary school? And I admit I was a little nervous, but I wasn't about to lie to this man because he had enough experience to see right through it. So I replied, no, sir, but I'm eager to learn. And his response blew me away. He leaned in a little bit and said, I'm going to make you quit. I, being who I am and loving the challenge of proving people wrong, smiled and said, I can learn whatever you need me to learn, and I can be dedicated, chef. Now, I'm sure you're listening to this and expecting a fantasy ending to this story, but it ain't happened like that. He did make me quit. I was there for maybe a half a year before I just couldn't take the haggling, the bitching, the comments, the do it again and again and again. I was young, and I didn't understand the mental fortitude you needed to have in that setting back then. Plus, I came to realize that every other person in this brigade did, in fact, go to culinary school. It was just something that he required from his staff, and he wasn't necessarily wrong. I mean, he required a basis of knowledge. He would provide the experience, but you needed to come equipped with the base. This chef was a big reason why I did end up going to culinary school years later, but that's a story for another show. And you know what? I still have that little brown book, and I still take recipes that I learned from then and use them to create variations in my restaurants today. It was one of my very first foundations into cooking. I have a closet full of old notebooks, recipes, and notes that I've collected over all these years. You never know when you may need a spark or some motivation or whatever. Dedicate yourself to paying attention. Write shit down and get shit done, and your chefs will respect your efforts and help you climb that ladder of success. And even if they don't, you have a hard copy of this shit for a reference. And the more you know, the better you'll be, and eventually someone will take a chance on you. If you liked what you heard today, leave me 5 stars on Spotify or a great review wherever you're listening to this, and make sure you visit us at theincrediblediscourse.com and all of our socials when they come up. I appreciate your time as always. I'm Mark Grigsby, and you've just been put through The Incredible Discourse. Till next time, where's my theme music?